It's time for the Newsmaker Show on News Talk AM 1480 WLEA.
I'm Brian O'Neill, and on with us today is Tom Osborne, formerly of ABC News, now with USUN Report. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be with you.
Obama and his handling of Russia. Wanted to get your take on it. Here's a clip from President Barack Obama talking with Steve Croft from 60 Minutes.
Rather than being able to count on their support and maintain the base they had in Syria, which they've had for a long time, Mr. Putin now is devoting his own military just to barely hold together by a thread his sole ally.
He's challenging your leadership, Mr. President. He's challenging your leadership.
Steve, I got to tell you, if you think that running your economy into the ground and having to send troops in order to prop up your only ally is leadership, then we've got a different definition of leadership.
Obviously, President Barack Obama taking a shot at the neocons.
Well, I think the president did not say, at least in that response to Croft, the bigger picture, which I think the international community has about this. Clearly, we know that Putin has been demonstrating his desire to return to the great days of the former USSR, but it's very clear that he hasn't the capacity to do that. He can only do dramatic scenes. One of them is to come to the rescue of Syria, his only ally, as the president said. But on the international level, I think that many diplomats are seeing this as a half good thing and a potentially very dangerous thing. Certainly by bombing the very people that the United States has been helping in Syria to oppose the Assad regime is dangerous. There's also the danger of the Turkish conflicts with their aircraft and the other allies that we have in the region. But mostly, I think the international community sees this as probably a necessary thing. As the president said, the Russians have had bases in Syria for some time. This is not something new. But this is a move toward bringing, we hope, the Syrians, particularly Assad and all of his entourage, and the various coalition partners to the conference table for a political solution. We know that there can only be a political solution. We can talk about that in more detail as to how that might unfold. But that basically now assures Russians not so much their aggression, underscoring that, but their place at the table to negotiate a peace, which in our consideration will not include Assad. But we found out very clearly that you can't get rid of a whole government and then have somebody to negotiate with. So it's very clear that we have to have our enemies at the table before we can talk.
Putin talked to the United Nations General Assembly. That was a couple of weeks ago. Audio here from Russia Today.
And the recent data of arms transfer to this most moderate opposition is the best proof of it. We believe that any attempts to play games with terrorists, let alone to arm them, are not just short-sighted, but fire hazardous.
What do you make of that statement, fire hazardous?
Well, it is a very dangerous situation, but we all know that we have to bring even the worst of our enemies to the table, and Putin and Assad are two of those. But he is actually, I think, really seeking a political solution regardless of his rhetoric. And in that political solution, you're going to have what you would call his client. That would be the Alawites, for sure. They must be assured their rights, just like everyone else, that they will be respected. We have to assure the Shiite populations, the Sunnis have to be there, the Kurds, and of course the horrible tragedy of the refugees. They have to have conditions in which they will truly have the right to return to reestablish their neighborhoods and their homes from which they had to flee. Now, this takes a long time, but you have to look at it this way. We could spend 10 or 20 years of a very expensive peace operation, as we are hoping to do when we get to that table, that would cost much less than one more year of this war. So let's hope that we're on the track for a political settlement. Now, whether it's with or without Assad, that remains to be seen. I've been told by very, very good sources, high sources, a former Undersecretary of State, who said that he felt that in the end, the Russians, if they are at the table, which they probably will have to be, they would be willing to give up Assad. But you really can't start a transition until we get to the table. And I think that's what he is trying to say right now, and certainly putting that into action as he just leaves us standing face one-on-one with him in the area.
The BBC is reporting online, and this came out on Monday, that President Putin of Russia is defending the military actions in Syria by the Russians, saying that Russia's aim is to stabilize the legitimate authority of Assad, and Russia wants to create conditions for a political compromise in Syria. That's what he told Russian state TV. What do you think of that, Tom Osborne?
Well, I think he's on the right theme, as I've been trying to describe. But I think what we have here, the problem that stands between us, and this is probably what we'll have to be discussing, and they are discussing behind the scenes. The unconditional stance that the only way that you can come to the peace table is if that person, Assad, gives up power. That's not going to work. Russia has to come in and prop up this state. We have to recall this is not a failed state. It's not the same situation as a failed state. This is a functioning state, a member state of the United Nations. And the way we get to these talks is to recognize that and deal with them on that level. Very few people believe there will be an acceptable continuation of that government after we go on to the talks, but we still have to get there.
We're talking with Tom Osborne, a U.S. UN report. Tom, this would not take you back, I suppose, to the days of when you were covering the Iran-Iraq war, the original war against Iraq back in the early 1990s, 1991, I believe. But Tom Osborne, you have a lot of contacts from those days when you worked at ABC covering the United Nations, and you referenced that you've been speaking with some top sources, I presume at the UN. What else are they saying about this conflict with Russia and Syria right now?
Well, let me underscore what I said before, and that this is kind of the same theme over and over again. Most people are trying, let's say the West right now is pinning talks on getting rid of Assad, but that won't work. You don't pin the peace talks on getting rid of Assad. That's not the proper way to begin a peace talks. The other aspect that we have today that's quite different than when we were dealing with Iraq and Saddam Hussein. At that time, we did not have what we have now. This is a permanent international criminal court. And the question is, should Assad should he be nervous about going to trial? Of course, and that's another aspect of this that I am hearing from my friends with the new permanent international court. Of course, he should be, as anyone should be who has committed crimes against humanity, against their own people. So with the establishment of this court, that presents even, I think, a greater threat to him that perhaps he should start cooperating now and follow on the Russians' lead and move toward some sort of political settlement that sends him somewhere else. But that does not excuse him in any way, by the way, of paying the price of responding to the international court. So that looms out there as well.
Talking with Tom Osborne on the Newsmaker Show here today. It's Tuesday, October 13th, day after Columbus Day. Tom, another international situation going on. This is from Reuters. A court in Iran has convicted Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian Iran's news agency said on Sunday. They say that he was California-born, was covering news over there, and accused and convicted of espionage. The entire media and all of Washington outraged by this, Tom Osborne.
Well, it is an outrage, and of course they mean it to be an outrage. People forget that this agreement we have with Iran on its nuclear weapons possibilities, it focuses only on nuclear. It doesn't say that we are going to have sweet sailing from here on. But we have to also, once again, look behind the scenes. The Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons was supported by Russia and Iran, and those chemical weapons have been removed. So while Iran must maintain its profile for domestic audiences at home, the hardliners, it's also listening to its general population, which says we want a diplomatic solution. We want this to end. So in a way, this is good. They put their cards on the table. They've convicted this gentleman. But now that they've convicted him, we hope the next step would be, okay, we're going to pardon this gentleman, or we're going to give him 6 months. It depends on, we'll see what the next moves are, but I know that they are moving. They want to move through a political solution in Syria, and they have a big card to play there. So we have to wait and see what happens after this conviction.
We're talking with Tom Osborne of USUN Report. He worked in a very interesting time in the 1990s for ABC TV News, and worked right under Peter Jennings, covering the United Nations. And, of course, Jennings covered a lot, as the three big anchors did in those days. Jennings broke up. Bill Clinton. I'd like to get Tom Osborne's take on the situation with Hillary Clinton and the emails in relation to Benghazi, and also his thoughts on Bill Clinton and his campaign statements from recent days. We'll talk more with Tom Osborne on the Newsmaker Show in just a moment on AM 1480 WLEA. On the Newsmaker Show, I'm Brian O'Neill, and Tom Osborne, when you worked for Peter Jennings, I'd love to know, what did Jennings think of the Bill Clinton years, and Bill Clinton in particular?
Oh, I think, I know that personally they got along very well. There were a few moments, of course, when Peter did that sit-down with him, and it was really a miserable moment, but something Peter had to do when he questioned his truthfulness about his affair with Monica Lewinsky. That was one of the low moments. But on the whole, I think Peter and Clinton got along quite well, and I think you could say that they were different people, but they were intellectual equals, and Clinton knew that, and Peter knew that, and so they came well prepared whenever they did interview with each other.
Hillary Clinton and the emails that have been released, in particular the Benghazi emails, that's what the big focus is. There's been a lot of talk of the emails in regards to Benghazi, the emails between Hillary Clinton and Sidney Blumenthal. Tom Osborne.
Well, anyone, and I'm sure that anyone listening, if they were asked to turn over all their emails, they would probably shrink into some closet and run away somewhere because we come to use that as our daily conversation. But Hillary is putting up a strong front. And the Benghazi hearings, have long been seen, whether you're political on the Democratic side or the Republican side, having the potential, I didn't say intention, but the potential of being political. Everything is political on Capitol Hill these days. And the fact that 4 Americans were killed, including our Ambassador Smith, made it even worse. Hillary's response is basically this, that all over the world, we have missions in the most dangerous parts of the world. They're under threat all the time. And it simply is not possible for us to cover all our bases all at once. The ambassador had been reassuring all along that he was one of these people who took chances, who tried to meet face-to-face with our enemies. And so these people saw an opportunity, they took it, and they could see that they could really make a mess of the American political situation by doing this, and that's what they did. A few people were responsible for this. I think generally, if the hearings come out as I think they will, unfortunately, they've been ruined by this political statement of McCarthy's. They'll never have any credibility, and certainly the Republicans in this administration don't have time to restart this train. It's not going anywhere.
In the Obama interview with 60 Minutes this past Sunday night, Obama said in regards to the Benghazi emails, yes, Hillary made a mistake, but no, it wasn't a crime.
That's interesting because we do have an FBI investigation, and no one has yet to offer an explanation of why. And until they drop that investigation, we really don't know how serious it is. I believe the president is right. She did make a mistake, in my opinion. She did make a mistake, but you can almost understand why, if you could have the technology after her husband was president, all the technology was there. Rather than rebuild the whole thing, to use it for both your personal use and your work at the State Department, all under one. And, of course, we've moved a long ways there technically, so she's just going to have to suffer the slings and arrows of this mistake. But I hardly think it derails her candidacy. I think her numbers go down, frankly, because of her way of campaigning. But she seems to be improving on that. So we'll see after the hearings if they tick up those numbers. We have a long way to go, about a year. So remember what happened in the last campaign. She came from way behind. She'll be, I think, pretty strong, and the hearings will kind of be an afterthought.
On the topic of the Clintons, this is Bill Clinton appearing on CBS TV with Stephen Colbert.
Because there are a lot of people all over the world that are really hacked off, that they think the system's rigged against them and the rich get all the gains. Mm-hmm. And in America, a lot of them believe that the Republicans have been rewarded they reward the people who go the furthest to the right. So the Democrats would be even more effective if they move further to the left.
Why do you think Trump is doing so well?
Because he's a master brander, and he's the most interesting character out there. And because he says something that overrides the ideological differences. If you look at the first debate, a lot of those guys were competing for who could be the most politically correct in the answers. Trump says, okay, I've supported Democrats, I've supported Republicans. Yeah, I used to be friends with Bill Clinton, who cares?
Your thoughts on Clinton's handling of those questions on Colbert?
I think he did pretty well, given the circumstances. It seems to me he always has an answer that sounds good, and then when you look at it a little bit more critically, sometimes you can see the holes in it. But I think he handled that pretty well. He's talking about Sanders. Clearly, he is the everything that the left wing of the Democratic Party would love to see. He's addressing really a very hard and concrete problem that we have to face in this country, regardless of party, and that is the inequality of income. I don't know what that requires, but everybody's going to be in that discussion in this coming election, and certainly the next president will, I think, deal with it regardless of party. And I don't really, frankly, know how. But it just can't go on the way it is. At least the middle class can't remain in the terrible position that they have been over the last decade. Each party, all three parties, including Sanders, is going to have to do that in practical terms. I think Sanders is a little bit better at it in the sense that he actually does offer suggestions. Not that I understand them completely, but I think he's someone who could put together a program that could kind of reverse this trend.
You talk about the Clintons. There's something in the news. It made Breitbart yesterday. A guy named Rob Morrow from the right did something which, the left could only thank him for doing, I suppose, in a certain sense, because it makes the right look terrible. In another sense, nobody's glad he did it. This is Rob Morrow and he posted this on YouTube, talking to Chelsea Clinton at Chelsea Clinton's book signing event.
You say it's targeted towards teenage girls?
It's targeted actually to kids, girls and boys.
Would you say that Bill Clinton also targets teenage girls, except for sexual reasons?
I would say my book is really resonating with...
If that's not totally classless, Tom Osborne, I don't know what is. Audio from Breitbart.
It's pretty classless. I think whatever party you are, you have to give this guy a break on that. I mean, he basically, I'm talking about the president, he basically has owned up to apologize for it, has paid a horrible price in many ways. All of his life he'll live with this on his profile, whatever the history is. I don't think his daughter would have the explanation that he has already given many times. It was, in his words, why did you do it? He said, because I could. And I think that's the bottom line, and he's admitted it. So those who are going to drag that dead cat out, aren't going to really get much mileage on it. It's history, and not that we should take it lightly at all, but that, it's been dealt with, he's paid the price, and it's time to move on.
It's not a great thing that he did, but I would say that to drag it up over and over and over again, and to the guy's daughter of all people.
No, I mean, let's face it, when you listen to the story of what happened to Monica Lewinsky, you think you're dealing with like a 15 or 16-year-old. And I have that impression in my head, and I think it was you some time ago reminded me that, this is a person who was 23 years old who worked at the Pentagon, who was a government official, and, things like this happen, not with the president. And I will not use that term, stuff happened. But, I mean, this happened, and she was a 23-year-old woman.
We've been talking with Tom Osborne, now with USUN Report, formerly with ABC. Tom, any final thoughts before we go?
Just to remind people, please remember, I think, that Russia is central in this convincing of Assad to rid the country of this civil war, and he's the only one who can do it. The Russians are the only one who can bring him to the table. So we should look at the Russians carefully as a very important catalyst to ending this horrible civil war, which most people have left to just given it up to just burn itself out, which is a tragedy.
Well, thank you very much to Tom Osborne, formerly ABC, now USUN Report, for joining us today. I'm Brian O'Neill on Newsmaker Show. ABC is next on AM 1480 WLEA Hornell.